the news that made it sound like it was better in Hastings or in Nebraska than it's been. So that's good.
Yeah, we are reducing our number of active cases, but Adams County is around 400 active cases right now, and it does not appear, it does not appear that we're having problems in our hospitals either. So,
and Dwight tested positive. It was a false positive, but we had to go quarantine for 2 weeks.
Oh, that's too bad. But you're kind of in quarantine already, huh?
Well, that's right. It didn't make any difference because we have been since February, I think.
I have to tell you, my niece's family, they live in Hall County, and the husband's a school teacher and she's a social worker, and they have 5 children. So even as careful as they are now in their second quarantine.
Yeah.
Oh.
And their little 7-year-old boy wrote a letter to Santa Claus last night asking to please get out of quarantine. Oh.
That's Santa's probably getting a lot of that this year. So
Poor little fella. He wants to go to school and see his friends.
of course,
sure.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's get started today. I would like, if I could, Jane, do you mind telling your little story about that I wanted you to tell a couple weeks ago about when you were a kid, because it really, we're kind of getting to the point now where we're starting to discuss some of those those issues. So take it away, Jane.
Okay. Well, when I was 10 years old, my Sunday school teacher asked our class, now, when Jesus comes back, where will he look for believers? Will he look in saloons and taverns? No. Will he look in dance halls? No. Will he look in movie theaters? Uh-oh. And there, I was in trouble because I had to go to the Saturday matinee at the Mayan Theater to watch The Perils of Nyoka, because I had to find out what happened to poor Nyoka. At the end of each serial, she would be about to be sliced in 2 or hit by a boulder. So I had to go. But then I'd get there, and then I'd start to worry, and I'd think, now what if Jesus comes back, and then I go home, and my family's gone, and there I am. So I made a deal with Jesus. I said, Jesus, if you can just delay your return until after the second feature, I swear I will never, ever, ever, ever go to a movie again as long as I live. And Jesus kept his part of the bargain, and I kept mine until the following Saturday. And so, but, and you know, and ever since then, when I walk out of a movie theater and I see that the world is pretty much the same as it was, I just feel relieved.
Yeah. we are getting to the place in this this very interesting apocalyptic book where some of these images that scare young Sunday school pupils, boys and girls, can be used to great effect. And, you know, in some of the areas that I'm from in Southern Ohio, you know, if you go to any camp meeting, as they call it, you're not going to hear anything but the book of Revelation. And usually it starts with chapter 6 and moves on to about chapter 20. And with all of these, you know, very, very violent images that we're going to be talking about. But hopefully this course will be enough to convince you all that there's more to the text than is commonly assumed. And I don't know about you, but I'm every time I come to a text, I learn something new, and I'm really being impressed by the idea of something that Mac talks about a lot, is just how Jewish John of Patmos is. And it really struck me this time as we begin to read chapter 6, just how much his hope for the future rests upon a Jewish hope for the future. And that Jewish hope always involved the restoration, not only of Jerusalem, but of the temple in Jerusalem. And we see allusions to it. And I just want to conclude chapter 5 by the new song that is sung. Remember, with this image, chapter 5 is this wonderful central image, which is really kind of a builds on the image that John sees in chapter 1. But there's the Lamb who's on the throne and the four creatures who praise God, and then of course the 7 lampstands, and then the 24 elders, and then you have these myriad angels around, and it creates this very centralized image of praise of God. And at the center of that is an altar we come to see, very clearly. We will in chapter 6. All of this is a reference to what's known as the throne room of the temple. And we're going to see fairly soon that this altar is a place where Christians, along with Christ, have gone through a kind of sacrifice, as you would expect from a highly hopeful Jew looking forward to the restoration of Jerusalem and the restoration of the temple. But before I start reading chapter 6, I'll just remind you of the song that's sung. The Lamb is revealed. The scroll with the seals is revealed, and everyone begins singing this song. The 24 elders, the beast, the 4 heavenly creatures. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slaughtered by your blood, and by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe and language and people and nation. Very important there, because there's the one thing that's going to be different from the previous Jewish understanding. John, despite all of his Jewishness, is still wed to this idea that this is not just something for the Jews anymore. You've ransomed for your blood saints from every tribe. There's Jewish tribe and language and people and nation, going from a small circle out and out. And finally, the end, ethnos, being where we get our word ethnic from. This is a universal salvation that is being revealed here through the sacrifice of the Lamb. And you've made them to be a kingdom and priests serving our God. This imagery taking place in the throne room of the temple is taking place with and for the benefit of people who are going to be priests, just as the Jews were called to be priests, a kingdom and priests. This is a priestly image that is in, remember, priests are mediators. Priests are the ones who pray to God for reconciliation. And this is going to be the role that the Christian believers will play. To the one seated on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. Worthy is the Lamb who was slaughtered to receive power and wealth, wisdom and might, honor and glory and blessing. These are the so-called the 7 honors. And so this idea of a universal priesthood that is comprised not just of Jews, but of Greeks as well, we might say, is consistent. And this is where, it's kind of ironic, because it doesn't appear that John has a lot of that's in common with Paul, but this is where he is consistent with Paul. And it reminds me of Paul's letter to the Galatians in chapter 3, and I'll read that here. Just as Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, so you see those who believe are the descendants of Abraham. Paul here is saying descent from Abraham isn't about blood, but it's about belief and righteousness. And the scriptures, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, declared the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all Gentiles shall be blessed in you. For this reason, those who believe are blessed with Abraham who believed. And then finally, the place where Paul really brings us home is Galatians 3:28. There is, as many of you were baptized into Christ, have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So John is consistent with Paul here. He is open to this idea that Gentiles will be a part of the kingdom. It's just the more specific aspects of how, well, liturgy and how sacred worship is to take place, rituals. He's going to be very Jewish in that respect. So it's no surprise that his image, his vision, is one of Christ, the slaughtered lamb, on the altar in the temple. And it's on the inner altar. You may know that in the Jewish temple, there were actually two altars. There was an altar outside of the temple itself, where a lot of sacrifices would take place. And then there was the altar within the Holy of Holies, within the temple itself. And that was the place where the seat of God was. And of course, this is where we see Christ. There was a lot there that I wanted to talk about, but we're going to move on, or we'll stay there forever. So any questions or comments about chapter 5 and that central image now that is going to open up new images and new visions? Any comments?
Dan?
Yeah.
Just before we came on, they were playing that selection from the Messiah, blessing and honor, glory and power be unto
Right.
you,
Yep.
and so it really resonated because of this class.
Yeah, well, and where did it come from? Right from what we were talking about, those 7 honors or so.
Mhm.
Well, we're going to get into a part of the text, and I don't know if I should read all 17 of these verses because I want to introduce it in some way, but we're looking now at chapter 6. But let me go on reading through some of at least 4 seals, okay? Chapter 6, verse 1. Then I, John, saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals. And I heard one of the 4 living creatures call out, as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another. And he was given a great sword. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come." And I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. But do not damage the olive oil and the wine." When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature call out, "Come." And I looked, there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by wild animals of the earth. That's enough to keep us busy for a while, so I'll stop there. Famous imagery here. We've seen it alluded to in literature, all the way to college sports. I think there was a group of football players back in the 30s known as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I don't know who they were. Any sports fans that can...
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame, Newt Rockne.
Okay. Geez, not everybody at once now. Now I'm
Nebraska beat them in Lincoln. And the
I
Notre,
should-
and the
I should have known.
Notre Damers ruined the city of Lincoln downtown.
Oh. Well, good. Yeah, Newt Rockne and I guess three of his teammates are called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse.
I think he was the coach of the Four Horsemen
Oh,
of the
Newt, yeah.
Apocalypse.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I'm not a football fan. Well, I'm a fan, but I just don't know much about football. So, but thank you for that little bit of trivia there.
Nebraska history.
Yeah, right, Nebraska history. As we begin to look at this image, and I don't know why this time, because I knew it before, but you know, when you read these texts, you come at them with different questions and different ideas. And I have to say, I'm so grateful for the fact that we're doing this class, because I myself am gaining new insights that are very, gratifying for me. And I hope you all are as well. But as obviously that's why we're teaching the course, so that you can have insights too. But as I read chapter 6, I was just struck at how important the prophet Zechariah is to John's visions. Now, we've been looking at the apocalyptic literature and its development over the last 2 years. We've been looking at this, and there was a point when we looked at Ezekiel, and we looked at the Book of the Watchers, and we looked at Daniel, and I mentioned Zechariah, but I kind of wanted to save it until we got to the Book of Revelation because of the parallels that happen between John and Zechariah. But before I talk about those, I want to just inform you who Zechariah was. He was one of the prophets who was prophesying at the time of the return of the Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now imagine what Jerusalem was like at this time. It had been utterly destroyed by the Babylonians about a generation or two earlier in 587. The temple was destroyed. The Ark of the Covenant was gone. The people were scattered. There was a group known as Samaritans living in the land who were practicing a form of Hebraic worship that was a little bit different than what the Jews coming back from Babylon were practicing. And it was in the midst of this that this prophet Zechariah gave this message of hope. And it was an apocalyptic message. He had these visions. Now, we've already seen how one of these visions plays a role in John's first chapter. You know, when John sees the seven, when he sees Christ with the sword coming from his mouth and the seven lamps and all of that, that is right out of Zechariah's vision in chapter 4 of the text itself. But now we have these 4 horses that have a very, very clear reference to the historical circumstances in which Zechariah found himself. Cyrus of Persia, destroys the Babylonian kingdom and establishes a peace in the land. In fact, Cyrus is seen as, a great king as a result of this, and it was the edict of Cyrus that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and to begin building their temple. And all is well, but Zechariah has got this sense that more needs to be done, that this peace needs to be really disrupted because this is not God's plan. And so I just want to read beginning at chapter 1, verse 7 of Zechariah. On the 24th day, on the 24th day of the 11th month, very much like Ezekiel here, right? He's got it down to the very day of the 11th month of Shabbat, in the year of second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, son of Iddo. And Zechariah said, "In the night I saw a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red, sorrel, and white horses. Then I said, "What are these, my Lord?" And the angel who talked with me said, "I will show you what they are." So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, "They are those whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth." Then they spoke to the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees. "We have patrolled the earth, and lo, the whole earth remains at peace." Then the angel of the Lord said, "O Lord of hosts, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, with which you have been angry these 70 years? And the Lord replied with gracious and comforting words. So the angel who talked, said the angel who talked to me, proclaim this message. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I am very jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion, and I am extremely angry with the nations that are at ease. For a while I was only a little angry. They made the disaster worse. So there's peace in the land, but these four horsemen are not just there to announce this peace, but they're also there to disrupt it, because God is going to work a plan that is going to be zealous for the city of Jerusalem. And throughout Zechariah is looking to this reestablishment of the temple. And when you get into, I believe it's chapter 5 or chapter 6, the temple will be rebuilt. There will be a high priest and there will be a king. The high priest's name is Joshua in Aramaic. That's Yeshua, which is the name of Jesus. And then there is the king, who was the grandson of Jehoiakim in the line of David. His name was Zerubbabel. And so this imagery that Zechariah saw as coming to take place is absolutely central to his message. You will see the four horsemen again later on in Zechariah. The trouble with this is that image, that establishment of Jerusalem as the city on the hill to which all the nations would flock never happened. There's another image in Zechariah that you probably are familiar with. And let me just read it to you, and we'll get back to Revelation. This is in Zechariah chapter 9. And there are really two sections of Zechariah. There's the first 8 chapters, and then there's the last 4 or so chapters. And this is from the last 4 or so chapters, which are rather obscure. But in the midst of this, we hear, "Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem." You're probably familiar with this, I would hope. This is what Jesus had in mind when on the Passover, or the week before Passover, he comes riding into Jerusalem on the colt, on the foal of a donkey, in a kind of a guerrilla theater way, you might say, because what was happening in Jerusalem at that time is that on the other side of town, Romans were riding into town on white horses, carrying their swords, to emphasize their power and might. But even Zechariah is looking forward to a new kind of Messiah in these oracles here. They're a little bit different from the oracles of the first 8 chapters. But all of Zechariah is about the restoration of Jerusalem. And that never happens. It never happens. There's a time, later on the Greeks take over, and then the Romans, and then the Jewish temple gets built, but it falls into a disrespectful kind of leadership. And so we have to ask ourselves if this book of Zechariah provides a model for John of Patmos. It was certainly a model for Christ. Does John of Patmos see, for example, this image we just saw in chapter 5 of Christ, the Lamb, on the slaughtered Lamb on the throne in the throne room of the temple. Is this the restoration that Zechariah looked for? And is John reproclaiming a new kind of restoration of Jerusalem? And I would argue that Zechariah plays a more important role in this book than we often give it credit for. So I don't want to keep going on and talking, because there might be people who want to say something. Anybody want to make a comment or ask a question about this? A very quick overview of Zechariah, sorry. Well, then I just want to reemphasize something that Mac has been emphasizing, the utter Jewishness of John throughout this text. The importance of sacrifice, we've already seen this, a lamb sacrificed to ransom many, a universal sacrifice. But now the difficult part begins, because we're going to see, and this image that Kester refers to, I think is so wonderful, and I'd like to spend some time on it.
That's Albrecht
We're
Dürer.
going to see, and this is the Four Horsemen of Apocalypse by Albrecht Dürer, who was 16th century engraver, and did hundreds of these engravings, and every single one of them is equally as intricate. But the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse are not under the control of Satan. Many times you'll hear people talk as if they are, they're the instruments of Satan. It's very clear that what they are doing, and Dürer makes this absolutely clear as well, by the presence of the angel. You can see where my cursor is, sorry. The presence of the angel in this engraving. All of this is happening under the auspices, you might say, of God. And then listen to some of the passive language here. I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, And he came out, and who calls them forth but the four, a voice coming from the four creatures around the throne. So all of this is done with the hand of God. The second, and out came another, a horse bright, and its red horse, its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another. And he was given a great sword. Now all of a sudden we are talking about some pretty difficult theology, right? Because it's emphasizing this idea that this is not something that's contrary to God's will. This is something that God is permitting to happen on the earth, which creates all kinds of problems for us, because we try to emphasize this God of love who, opposes these kinds of things. But let's save that question for a little while and talk about what these horses represent. And I think Kester's quote, it's on page 86. It's one of the reasons I use this book, because it's so good. Because what we have is concentric circles, really. The white horse, then the red horse gets a little closer, then the black horse, and then the pale green horse. Or we might actually turn that around and say that, when we think about possibilities of these things happening always, military conquest is a problem. Civil strife is even a greater and more likely problem in our lifetime. Economic despair, probably more probable than civil strife. Death is universal and affects us all. So as the seals open up, part of God's will involves these four horses, the white horse representing military conquest. And I've tried to create some details of Dürer's Durer's engraving here. Here's what the original piece looks like. You know, the rays coming from heaven as if to indicate that this is God's will that's being done. The angel overseeing the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Off on the right here is, well, here's the angel. And then you have the three, I didn't position this very well, but the three riders. The rider on the white horse, representing conquest, external conquest. Kester makes the point that we're not talking about the Romans here. We're talking about a constant threat that was always in the mind of the Romans. There's a group of people known as the Parthians, and they were able to stave off Roman advances, you know, in the 5 or 6 decades before Christ, into the east. And what made them so powerful is they were archers that could ride horses and shoot at the same time. By the way, this is one of the reasons that the only war won that Americans lost on American soil was partially a result of this very skill. The Indian Wars of the 1860s, the Indians were not a match for American cavalry because of their guerrilla tactics, and also because they could ride on horses and shoot bows and arrows and guns hanging off the side of a horse, you know. So this kind of threat from without that we still feel today. I mean, my goodness, one of the riders of the white horse in the news right now is this, the way that Russians seem to have been able to hack some of our governmental agencies, and have been doing so, collecting information for the last 6 months. There's your white horse with the rider wielding the bow. The second horse is something that's a little closer to home, and this is the rider on the red horse wielding the sword. And this represents the civil strife that at the time of John was nevertheless felt at the hands of the Roman overlords. The Romans were very, very jealous of the peace that they were able to establish in the land. But, you know, irony of ironies, the way that they were able to establish the Pax Romana was through the threat of violence, the threat of civil strife, of wielding the sword over others. And of course, Christians in John's time, though there wasn't widespread persecution, we've already seen how there was persecution, for example, of Antipas, who became a martyr for his beliefs, for his testimony. And then the rider on the black horse, the one that's largest, well, I don't have him, the one that's largest in this image and kind of central is the one that really affects a lot of us, carrying the scales over here, representative of commerce, economic commerce. And isn't it interesting, this is so subtle, but isn't it interesting what the voice of the four creatures says about this black horse? I heard the third living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. But do not damage olive oil and the wine." The commentaries that I've read have said, you know, a quart of wheat was barely enough to feed a family. And, you know, after you've done that, there's not a whole lot left over for oil and wine, so to speak. And so this is where most of the people in the Christian church were. But, you know, they were feeling economic difficulties, economic hardship, just barely being able to get by. But economic despair does not affect everybody the same way. The wealthy will continue to eat and will continue to have the luxuries of oil and wine. The angel says, do not damage the olive oil and the wine. Within this economic disparity, the injustice of people barely being able to eat while others enjoying luxury. And then finally, the rider known as Death, with Hades following behind. Really interesting. I wanted to show you this image of Hades. Dürer no doubt got this image from a lot of the medieval images of Christ and the harrowing of hell when Christ is bringing out those who were in hell when Jesus descends into Hades. This is precisely the image you see on a lot of those medieval folios, for example. But, you know, Dürer made clear that it was a person of high status wearing the crown that is being consumed by by the mouth of Hades here. Death is no respecter of persons. It comes for us all. So I wanted to, and then I want to give people an opportunity to respond to this, because this is very interesting, very compelling stuff. I wanted to read what Kester says about this. I'll be reading from page 86 of the Kester text. Albert Dürer's woodcut of the Four Horsemen shows how these threats work on readers. And Kester is saying that the emphasis here is not to predict something that's going to happen, but to establish a kind of uneasiness about, people's place in the world. And you can read about that on page 85. The first horseman with his bow appears in the background of the picture, furthest away from the viewers. This placement is suggestive because fear of conquest by a foreign power is often furthest away from readers' minds. If the first horseman awakens a sense of distant uneasiness, the second horseman brings the threat a step closer by pointing to the violence that people perpetrate on one another. And this is chapter 6, verse 4 of Revelation. Danger is not limited to external invasions, but it can also come from internal conflict. The third horseman brings the threat still closer by depicting economic insecurity, as he grasps scales like those used in commerce. This horseman is the largest and most prominent in Dürer's picture, suggesting that economic difficulties loom largest in most people's minds. The fourth horseman, who represents death, is in the lower foreground of the picture, together with the bizarre creature that represents Hades. Viewers' eyes often overlook the figure of death as their attention is drawn to the large horseman representing economic uncertainties, but death is the threat that sits in the lap of each viewer. No one escapes it. I thought that was a wonderful paragraph. But what Kester wants to emphasize here, and what many interpreters of Revelation don't get, these are not predictions. This is a sense of the state of the world in which we live. I mean, let's look at the four horsemen in our text here. Foreign invasion. I've already mentioned where we are with possible foreign, now it's cyber invasion we have to be concerned about. Internal strife. Well, I don't think anybody who lived through last summer can deny the internal strife that, that still haunts us. It seems to have been stifled a bit, but it is still there, seething beneath the surface. Economic despair and how the poor stand to lose the most. We're currently debating in Congress a stimulus passage that may not get passed, right? People looking forward to a Christmas where they, are worried about just keeping the heat on and paying their rent, let alone buying toys for their children. And what about death? COVID-19 has certainly brought the pale green horse and its horsemen face to face with our present reality. These are things that stand in contrast to the image that John just had, this image of glory and honor and all of those praises that are given to the slaughtered lamb. But it's the slaughtered lamb, not the one who stands aloof from it all, but one who has lived in the midst of these four horsemen. That praise is being given. So I want to stop there before we move on and see what kind of questions or comments you have. I mean, we're talking about the four horsemen of the apocalypse here. Somebody's got to have a question or comment. Dr. Storer, any thoughts?
No, Dan. I think it's marvelous, marvelous imagery, you know, to capture the reality that, you know, existed then and exists now.
Right, right. It's you know, timeless. And these things aren't chronologically happening one after the other. Sometimes interpreters will tell us. These are things that are always with us. This is the structure of sin in the world. And so we're juxtaposing chapter 5, what is happening in heaven, with chapter 6, what is happening on earth. And it creates that tension, and we're still waiting for it to be resolved on earth. Any other thoughts?
Dan, it occurs to me as you're reading about those images, the rider on the horse that has the scales and is saying, you know, you could have, you know, a bushel of wheat, but don't disturb the oil and that kind of thing.
Right.
I imagine that's been used in the past to justify the idea that poor people are supposed to stay where they are and you know, so sort of the misuse of Christianity that justifies some people having a lot and other people not having anything, that it's God's will.
Yeah, yeah.
About the scales have always meant the scales of justice, and I think that's more common. Maybe it doesn't really date any earlier than the Renaissance or something, but I have a rough time seeing the scales other than justice, because of the blind justice holding the scales that every
Right.
lawyer's office has.
And that's a very Greco-Roman idea, but for a poor person, and we see this throughout the Hebrew Bible when the prophets talk about those who sell and put their thumb on the scale. You know, a scale is also an image of injustice, because it's the way that those in commerce can often cheat those who are buying from them. You know, figure out all kinds of ways to make the scale, because you usually bought by weight, right? You know, and you would compare the weight to the amount of, you know, silver that you were paying, or, you know, the denarius or whatever you were using. But there were always ways. The scale was the, you might say, you know, the fine print of of the ancient world, right? You know, how the large print giveth and the fine print taketh away is the lines from Tom Waits. But the fine print that tooketh away from those who were part of the, you know, the commercial trade, were the ways that scales would be used in very unjust ways. And it was always against the poor. And you know, at this time as well, this was happening in Rome. It's, as John is writing, we're starting to see the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire. You know, this isn't just happening to Christians. This is happening across the Roman Empire. you know, and people have made the comparison with the United States, and I think in many ways it's valid, but you had this wonderful Roman Republic that kind of fell into, I guess disrepair due to people's extortion of money, kicking the people off of their land, of their farmlands, so that you had this increasing aristocratic class who controlled vast amounts of wealth, and then you created this poor underclass who had nowhere to go, so they went flocking towards the cities, and it started to become a real problem for the Romans. And it was the beginning of the fall of what we might call a democratic system under the Republic, because
doesn't that really start with Caesar crossing the Rubicon?
Yeah.
That when troops were forbidden to come to Rome as any closer to the Rubicon River, and this is the big decision for Caesar, which he writes about in his memoirs. Is he's really taking the first steps toward empire and
autocracy.
Yes, right.
Yeah, that's right. Gee, I mean, where have we seen that before? You know, it's amazing how
we're crossing the Potomac.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I wonder what there are all kinds of allusions I can think of to the present day Rubicon here. But yeah, I mean, these four horsemen are with us always, right? And will be till the day of, to the day of our judgment, I guess. What other comments do you have about this so far? I hope you appreciated the Kester quote, because it's just so insightful, foreign invasion, civil strife, economic despair, and then finally death. This is the world in which we live. But the difficult question is the one of theodicy that we might want to ask. All of these happen as a result of God's will. I mean, it's very clear in the text that these things are allowed to happen, which is, in the time that we have available to us, I don't think that's the question of theodicy that we're going to be able to answer. Any more comments here?
Well, I have a comment, and I'm kind of new to the group, so perhaps you've talked about this before, but I find it kind of reassuring when you say that the four horsemen will be with us forever and have always. It kind of contradicts some of the talk I have about, boy, these are the times, can't see this and this and this is happening.
Yeah.
And I'm getting from you that, well, it's been happening off and on for the whole history of the earth. So we don't really know when the end times are. You were saying it's not a prediction.
Right.
And that's interesting to me, because an awful lot of people are going around trying to figure out if this is the end times.
Right. It's not a prediction, it's more of a description. But you can, all you need to do is get on the internet and type in four horsemen of the apocalypse, and you will find all kinds of attributions, whether it's, what's his name in Russia right now, or Donald Trump, or
Yes.
Xi Jinping in China. And, people will call this out and say, this is happening. And of course, in the 70s and 80s, a man by the name of Hal Lindsey wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, where he tried to predict what was going to happen. And he saw all of these prophecies as coming true in our current age. And that's not what we're talking about. I'm glad that, Jean, that you said that you found it comforting, because in many ways, this book of Revelation is being written not to scare, but to comfort, but not to comfort in a simplistic way.
Mhm.
Very realistic about what our present circumstances are as Christians in the first century or Christians in the 21st century. But ultimately, the message is the message that I hear from Pastor Greg every Sunday morning. This is a message of hope. It's not going to pull any punches. It's not going to avoid the tough questions. It is going to speak in very symbolic language about the threats we have to our own health and security and, you know, the spiritual harmony, contentment. But in the end, and this is where the book of Revelation, people tend not to focus on those last two chapters. And, you know, I want to tell you right now, they're great final two chapters. In fact, they summarize and they bring to a nice, tidy conclusion the entirety of the 66 books of the Bible, if you're reading the Protestant Bible.
Mhm.
So we've got that to look forward to. But we're going to have to wade through a lot of mud and briars before we get there. And folks,
I like the image. I like the image of that over all that awfulness, God's still up there.
right.
I
Yeah.
mean, we're not alone with all that stuff. There, God is still up there
Right.
with us during this time.
And an abiding presence, and an abiding presence who has redeemed the world through this so-called slaughtering, the sacrifice of the Lamb.
Mhm.
That is going to come to fruition soon in John's mind. So, Gene, don't feel hesitant to jump in. You know, it doesn't matter if you've been here 2 days or 2 years. So just, you know, I appreciate
Well,
any comment.
I feel like you may have already talked about that, and I'm like,
No.
ah.
No. But I do have to say, I have a meeting that I must attend at 1 o'clock. So I will need to stop our class a little early. I hope that's not too much of a disappointment. Would anybody like to have the last word or the last comment before we leave? Jane, thank you for your little story at the beginning.
Okay. Anytime.
Yeah. Now that you can watch movies in your own house.
Yeah, I see. I don't have to go out anymore.
Yeah, who knows what God, you know, what kind of
Yeah,
judgment.
I wonder if God will take us if we're watching at home.
Well, I also know that you've made wine in that house too. So,
Well, that's true. Oh my, we're just not going to make
oh, how far you have fallen.
it.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time we spend together. And, you know, I hope we can, you know, continue. And if you have questions as you're reading Kester, please bring them to the class and we can, you know, try to address those. So thank you, everyone. You're all looking
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
I'll see you later. Bye.
Thank you.